Is it going to let me record? There we go. Okay, so we're going to make a start. I am very excited to be hosting today's Data Conversations event. This is the 8th event of this type that Lancaster University has delivered, but it is the first one to be online and also the first to allow guests from outside of our organisation too. So wherever you are, welcome to our session today. I'm Joanne Fitzpatrick. I'm Research Data Manager at Lancaster University Library, and I'm joined by my colleague Nicola Wiley, who is Research Intelligence Project Officer, and we will be managing the session today. I don't want to talk for too long because we've got 4 really amazing speakers available for you today, and there will be time at the end for questions, and I don't want to eat into that. So very quickly, we will go through this housekeeping slide. So as I say, this event will be recorded and shared publicly. So please turn off your camera and microphone unless invited to ask a question verbally and you're comfortable with being on the recording. Please ask questions via the chat and state whether this is for a specific speaker or for all speakers, and we'll take questions right at the end. And please don't use the raise hand facility. We're not going to be using that today. Also, with the questions, if you could please like and heart questions other attendees ask that you particularly like. The ones with the most hearts and likes, those are the ones we'll ask first. And then finally, we'd encourage you to please use the chat to discuss topics being presented on throughout, because this is Data Conversations. And in the absence of the usual talking together over pizza, we'd encourage you to discuss the subject matter between yourselves just in the chat. And myself and Nicola will manage that. Okay, thank you. So our lineup today. Our speakers joining us are all Lancaster University PhD students from a range of humanities disciplines. And they've been asked to present today on how digital humanities impacts on their research data management practices. So the order they will present is as follows. First, we have Ben Wills-Eve, who is from the History Department. Then we'll have Anoud Abusalim from Educational Research. And finally, a joint presentation by Ellen Roberts and Samuel Oliver from Linguistics. And hopefully we will have 50 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. So I'm going to pass straight over to Ben, who will open the event today. And I will stop sharing my screen so he can share his. Thank you, Ben.
Fab, is that up for everyone? So, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, fab. Right, so yes, my presentation looks really about my experience of research with social media data and how this is managed and really the effects of using DH methods and trying to navigate what's quite a grey area in terms of how you can collect and store this data. So data management in general, there are 5 key phases: data collection, storage, analysis, sharing, and then for a PhD student, some sort of long-term data storage plan, which is part of the university's data structures, which I don't have that much to do with. But in terms of actually carrying out digital humanities research with social media data, I think the first 2 points are the focus of this presentation, and really data collection and the ethics around data collection is a lot more complicated than I thought when starting the PhD. And so this is what I'm really going to focus on. If it's something you're, say, in your first year of starting a project like this, even in social sciences, dealing with this sort of data, there's quite a lot to consider that you might not have thought of. So let's start with social media data collection. I'm going to say more about ethics in a minute, but if you're going to collect and analyze data from any social media platform now, you need an ethics application in most cases. And the reason behind this is obviously there's been far greater public awareness in the last few years around how their data is used online, especially on social media, primarily outside of academia. But academic ethics and academic rigor is far greater than that seen in industry. So a lot of the ethics you will be, well, the ethical standards you'll have to meet to do your research, it's safe to say that you wouldn't be doing this in industry. I think that's fair. And in line with how you think about collecting data ethically is then the practicalities of doing so. And again, this recent years, this has got more difficult. So social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, these sort of places where you might want to collect data either for social sciences or DH, the limits now on what you can collect over a certain time period have got more restrictive. If you're going to use their API, which is effectively a controlled way of accessing data from a social media platform in a more automated manner. So there are you can write your own code to do this, or there are plenty of third-party online services and software solutions that will do it for you, some of which are free. But again, if you're thinking about, am I doing this in line with ethics? If you're going to use a third-party service, you have to be very clear about what they're doing. Because if it turns out they're not collecting it in quite the right way, or they're not anonymizing it properly, that's a problem for you, or it means you have to do more work later down the line. If you can write your own code, that's ideal, but it takes a bit of time to learn how to do this. I do it all in Python, and I'd suggest that's a good place to start if you're looking at this sort of work. And then in terms of data processing, I mean, this isn't just social media data and it isn't just DH either, but social media data does have some odd vagaries you have to be aware of. So if you're doing Twitter, dealing with hashtags, maybe hashtags are key for your research. Or maybe if you're trying to do linguistic work, how do you deal with hashtags? They're not standard tokens or words you might want to analyze. So it's a case of thinking, well, in collecting all this stuff, am I going to process and clean up my data before I store it, maybe in a database? Or am I going to do all that later and just get as much as I can to start with? And data storage, again, tied in with collection. And a key point for ethics is you need to make sure your data is stored securely. And for ethics, this means storing it on your university OneDrive, unless you have a very clear plan about how your own storage device is thoroughly encrypted. And you also need to make sure for data storage that whatever you use, whether it's a database, an Excel, or even if you enter this stuff manually, that you can go back, find specific data points. So for example, Twitter specifies in its policy that you must be able to delete data you collect, which is deleted on its platform. So if someone removes a tweet and you've collected it in the past, in theory, you should go back through your data, find it and delete it, and then you remove it from any analysis. Now that is an absolute nightmare. And whether this happens in practice or not, who knows? But in line with ethics and policies, that's something you should in theory be able to do. So you need to make sure you can design database with that in mind. Again, more on ethics, and from a digital humanities perspective, it's made this an even grayer area than it already was. So we've touched on the fact that you now need ethics applications for social media data in most cases. This is an evolving area, so I submitted an application a few months ago, and by the time I read through the guidance, it had already changed by the time I submitted it, so I had to do it again. So just expect difficulty for this, and if you're planning to do any work with social media, this should be the first thing you look at. Ethical guidelines, and I will post some in the chat at the end. They do exist, but they're understandably vague, and they usually focus on social science research, which has often a more direct influence on human participants as Twitter users than humanities research. So, for instance, I've been collecting posts from automated accounts or bots, looking at how they share historical facts, heritage and museum collections. You think, well, that's not really an ethical issue there, but then you want to find out who follows these bots and your audience for this sort of stuff. They all count as human participants because they're social media users and you're accessing their data in some way. And this comes into the point about lots of grey areas here. And really, if you're not sure what a grey area is, consider everything to be an important ethical step you have to consider so that you don't get caught out later down the line. And there is some tension here. It's irritating to be following strict ethical guidelines for academic research when many of these platforms, Facebook especially, do not follow ethical guidelines in their practices or their data management. So that's one ranting point. And also, in terms of following the platform policies to the letter, if you do this, it's very hard to get hold of all the data you need to do rigorous academic research, whilst one, being ethical, and two, doing the research properly so that its benefits are also therefore ethical. And you can get tied in knots here. I think that the main takeaway is cover everything as thoroughly as you can, argue everything thoroughly, and find a way to collect as much data as you can. You can always get rid of it later if you store it properly. Aside from social media, because a lot of DH research uses online sources and digital archives, but not social media, these points still apply in certain ways, and in many ways outside social media, research ethics is a much grayer area. There's been a big push on ethics in social media recently, so there are specific guidelines for this. But the guidelines around collecting data more generally from other sources online are even vaguer. So again, I'd say apply the social media guidelines to anything else just to be on the safe side. For instance, I was doing some research looking at the sale of archaeological artifacts on eBay. Now, eBay doesn't really count as a social media platform, it's an e-commerce platform, but it's in the same sort of vein. And a lot of the information on there can be equally sensitive. And then you start dealing with issues around copyright. If I'm downloading images as data, am I breaching copyright, and so forth? This also comes into consideration when you're doing research using digital archives. Usually, some will say this is a open access, freely available resource, and you can use it for research. Fair use usually covers research, but when you're dealing with platforms that aren't designed with research in mind, such as eBay, this is a far trickier area. You need to be very careful about that. And the same goes for if you're collecting data by web scraping. So if there's no API or specific data resource available for a website, for instance, an online auction house, then if you're collecting data by scraping the site, you will probably be breaking their policies. And that's something you need to think very carefully about, because that won't be seen as ethical by the ethics committee. Last point is collaboration with non-academic partners. We've mentioned that in industry, a lot of these ethical aspects are less rigorously discussed and enforced. And so if you end up doing research alongside a partner, you need to make sure that your views, I wouldn't even say your views, but your approaches to dealing with this data management and collection are aligned, so that you don't end up analysing someone else's data which has been collected in a way which contravenes your own ethical frameworks, because that just can become a real mess. And that's probably the hardest thing to solve here. And I don't have any solutions, unfortunately. So thanks for listening. I will pop these links in the chat. I'd say the top one about ethical guidelines, that's incredibly useful. The second one is an excellent paper which rants about social media platforms in general. And if you're looking at starting on Twitter and you're new to this sort of thing, collecting data, the link at the bottom is a great place to start. So I'll put these in the chat, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Ben. That was really interesting. I think we're all absolutely reeling from the fact that Twitter expects you to remove deleted tweets from research.
Yeah, it's a nightmare.
Yeah, really useful to know. Thank you. Okay, so I'm not going to talk for too long at all. I'm going to pass straight over to Anood with our second presentation. So if you'd like to share your slides, Anood, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I started sharing. I hope that everyone can see the slides. Just sorry, can you hear me? Sometimes my microphone doesn't work.
Yeah, we can hear you and see
Perfect.
your slides.
Yes, perfect. So I'm going to talk about bibliometrics, which is different than data mining and Twitter. And I'm going to talk about the bibliometrics from a different point of view, which is how to use it to inform policy in social sciences and humanities research. Just a brief definition of bibliometrics for people who are not familiar with it. It's the analysis of books and articles and scholarly output through different network analysis. What's tempting about using bibliometrics in the current neoliberal climate in academia, with all of the interest in impact and measuring output, is that bibliometrics can transform something that is so intangible, scientific quality, into a manageable entity. This becomes so relevant when you think about policymakers, evaluation bodies, and how they would like to see impact and output. And it has been successfully done in different social sciences: psychology, economics, linguistics, literature, history. As I was saying before, for research evaluation, bibliometrics really becomes so useful. Before, it used to be limited to librarians and their assessment of scholarly output. They are so useful when used in social sciences and humanities, and especially when the data exceeds the human capabilities to process it. I'll start by, those are really helpful links on bibliometrics for those who are interested in it. Not here to market bibliometrics per se. I'm so lucky that my supervisor is very good in bibliometrics, and I ended up working on some module assignments for bibliometrics. And here, this is what I'm going to share to show how the simple quantitative method can help in informing policies, decision-making, and understanding of the growth of a discipline, which was a paper I submitted for a module here in the Educational Research PhD program, Evaluative Cultures in Higher Education, and it ended up being a published piece of work. I started looking at my own discipline, which is second language writing, and surprisingly or unsurprisingly, my discipline is highly Americanized. It just relies on knowledge produced in North America. And I wanted to see why is knowledge outside the North American continent is not accepted or is not published. So this is how the research design was conducted. Because bibliometrics works with databases such as Web of Science, Corpus, I used Web of Science to go over research articles on second language writing. And my research questions were what are some of the characteristics of second language research topics, second language, and what are the characteristics and distribution of academic units that produce second language writing research. Again, the point of using novel methods in what is usually a standard social sciences inquiry is that it helps in informing the discussion. It adds different understanding to it. I have so many messages on the chat. So data collection, and this is the boring bit. Once I started accessing the Web of Science, there should be a lot of cleaning of the data and removing duplicates. And this is where, like any data management system, you have to be so organized. And so careful, and any mistake that happens in the data collection and the data cleaning phase becomes a very, very costly mistake later on. And from the practical side of things, it's again like any data management system, organization and keeping record of the search strings that were used to avoid any duplication. And those were the different search strings I used. And my tip, again, be organized and a lot of trial and error to make sure that you are getting all of the results that are representative of the inquiry, in that case, the research articles. And I used R, because I'm not good with Python, and I just had to use Excel here. And this is how good bibliometrics can be. It transforms a lot of the data into good visual. And through this search, downloading all of the articles on my discipline, second language writing, published in Web of Science, I have seen, I could document the increase in it and how it was classified. I can see, its growth rate, which was hard to calculate initially using the journal citation reports. And this is an issue of access. You have to make sure that the library has the most recent journal citation reports. And to answer the initial research questions about the identity of the discipline, this became so easy with bibliometrics by focusing on the areas it examined. It also became so easy to find the academic units that produce second language research, and to think of that from a policymaker point of view. This is a very helpful visualization of what could be otherwise a very boring description if it's done in written format. And the maps, which were done on Excel, because I couldn't, R was hard for those, were very helpful in the final output. Can everyone see the slides? I'm noticing messages about that. are on slide 18. Yeah. No, you don't need R. I did that. I have, again, I'm so lucky I have a very good supervisor. Gemma was helpful with R. But no, you can do this easily with Excel. I personally think that R is easier, but for bibliometrics. And that is a very interesting thing later on. And this, again, something that you can easily produce. I'm not sure if this is R or Excel. You can produce with Excel about a limited data set that can show you the growth of a discipline, which is in, again, culture of evaluation, culture of impact, culture of output. It became so important to show in a visual narrative how researchers are having some hard time accessing or accessing the community of researchers that produce second language research because of its limitation in North America. I think I am done. So talking about the basic one, I had to put the codes myself, but it is easy to clean, but I had to clean initially in Excel as well. That is a very important lesson to learn. The cleaner the original data is, the better. I forgot, there is a bibliometrics package, but I did not use it. I can find the name and send it to Joanne.
There's possibly a lot of tools out there, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Anoud. There's a couple of questions in the chat, and I know you've answered mine as you're going along, so there's just a quick one from Dominic I thought we could maybe answer before we move on. Just saying, which R package did you use?
I will find that out and send it to you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
You've answered that already. Okay. Right, we're going to move on then. Thank you very much for that really interesting talk, and I'm sure there'll be more questions at the end if you don't need to disappear. But I will pass over to Ellen and Samuel next with our final talk.
Hi, can you hear me? Let me just check that you can all hear me first. Perfect, everyone, you're nodding. That's always a good sign. And then I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you can all see my slides as well. Can you see my slides? Yeah, perfect. Okay, so welcome to our talk's a bit different, I think, based on the other two. So hopefully this will be something interesting. I just hope that's the case. So welcome to our talk on Is This a Tagger I See Before Me? Annotation in Corpus Linguistics. So firstly, I'd like to introduce both of us. So I'm a first year PhD student in English and linguistics and English language, researching Shakespeare's language. Sam is also a PhD student. He's in his second year of his part-time research. I focus on the linguistic makeup of genre, and Sam focuses on the meta-language of politeness and impoliteness. And I'm not going to say any more about Sam's research because that will come later. So our talk is a two-parter, like Joanne mentioned. For the first 10 minutes, I'm going to outline what is corpus linguistics, an introduction to annotation and tagging, and examples of tags in the enhanced Shakespearean corpus. And then at the 10-minute mark, I'll hand over to Sam, who will discuss how he's used tags in his own PhD research to look at meta-language. We will change the sharing at 10-minute mark, so hopefully that will go smoothly, but please bear with us if it doesn't. So let us begin. So firstly, what is corpus linguistics? Corpus linguistics is an established method within the linguistics discipline. Broadly speaking, it's a digital method used to study large volumes of text. So we take large volumes of digital text, literally in Latin, corpus meaning a body. So we take bodies of text and we study this using specialist software such as CQP Web by Andrew Hardy based at Lancaster, and Conc, which is another free software from a guy called Lawrence Anthony over in Japan, and there are many others as well. Typically, the method involves counting features to tell us more about linguistic phenomenon, and like Ben mentioned earlier, this can be tokens, this can be words, this can be any other feature that the researcher themselves defines in their research questions. Typically, the approach is quantitative, so it is based on numerical counts. However, it can be used to inform qualitative research as well. Interestingly, corpus linguistics has become widely adopted in the digital humanities, with a lot of the methods and tools being uptaken in other areas of digital humanities and adapted for use there. That's all great, but one of the issues facing corpus linguists is how do we meaningfully represent text in a corpus? Firstly, it needs to be machine readable, but how do we represent some of the more nuanced features of our text? And this is a question that can be asked of any corpus. So like Ben mentioned with Twitter, how do you actually input things like hashtags into a corpus meaningfully so we can actually interpret these on a different level? So we're going to look at Playtex. As some of you may have guessed from our title for our presentation, we focus on Shakespeare. And Playtex themselves are particularly complex. I'm sure Sam will agree with me here, because there is things such as dialogue, stage directions, you've got interaction between characters, and how do we preserve these features when we convert them from the text artifact itself, like the Playtext, into a machine readable format for computers to basically then count? So we can highlight some of the features that we might have issues with here. So for example, we could just take the text, so literally ignore the character names. So you could ignore, I don't know if you can see my laser pointer, but you can ignore theseus here at the start, as in it's just the name of the person who's speaking. You could choose to disregard that. However, some would argue that you're actually losing some of the meaningfulness here, because you could basically look at the different character speeches across the corpus and compare how these characters speak. So if we choose to disregard that, what does that mean for our corpus? And these are questions that do face corpus linguists when we compile these corpora. One particular example here is the interaction here between Hermia and Theseus. The shortening of their names is her and the, which becomes particularly problematic if you were then searching for these as words. So if you were counting instances of her in a, say, a gender-based exploration of Shakespeare, every instance of Hermia speaking, if you did include the character names, would throw off your counts. So again, these are particularly problematic for us. And how do we overcome this? Another issue we face, yay, more issues, is the actual nature of our language artifact. So one complexity that is here is the historical spelling. So this is the screenshot from the first folio, and then it's been transcribed in the Early English Books Online Text Creation Partnership project. So it literally is a word-for-word translation. There are some variation in here with the extra E on moon, for example. But this isn't necessarily meaningful for when we want to compare things. It has a new, like another layer that we might want to retain, but we might want to modernize our spelling. So for example, this extract from CQP Web has the modernized version, but some researchers actually want to retain the original early modern spelling. So if we make the decision to modernize, we end up losing that extra layer. So again, how do we represent this in a meaningful way? So one possible solution to this is through corpus annotation. So this is kind of in the data preparation or the data selection stages of your research project. So firstly, what is annotation? Annotation can be defined by Jeffrey Leach, who's a well-known linguist, as the practice of adding interpretive linguistic information to an electronic corpus. It also can refer to the end product of the process, the electronic representation of the language material itself. So in other words, annotation is another tool in the corpus toolbox and consists of markup tags added to a text. So this might not be very clear at the minute, but I will go into more detail into what actual tags may look like. But first, let me introduce some of the taggers that are widely available as off-the-shelf. So mainly these are programmed for modern text, which does have its own issues when used for historical texts, as they have to be corrected manually. But basically, annotation, either automatically using these taggers or manually, can be added to any level of your data. So again, going back to Ben's example, you could actually tag hashtags as hashtags and then separate them from the rest of the body of the tweet. So then you can look at how hashtags are represented versus how the body of the tweet is presented. Lancaster itself has a long reputation in building taggers alongside Corpora and other Corpus tools. So for example, on the slide, 3 of the 4 mentioned there are actually built at Lancaster. So you've got Clause, Vard, and USAS are all built here at Lancaster. And as you can see, based on the annotations I've added, they can all be used for different types of annotation on the text. So you can tag grammar, you can tag spelling, and you can tag semantics. The project that we are actually using is a recent one from Lancaster, and it's the Encyclopedia of Shakespeare's Language project, hosted on the CQP Web, which is a free interface that anyone can sign up to. And it's called the Enhanced Shakespearean Corpus. And as far as I know, this is the first Shakespearean corpus that has been enhanced through corpus annotation. So, and just a word of warning, the next slide looks very scary, but don't worry, we're going to go through it together. So I'm very, very fortunate that Jonathan Culpepper, one of the lead principal investigators on the project, has agreed for me to show you behind the scenes of what happens on CQB Web. So what we have here are different levels of annotation. So you can see you've got angled tags. These angled tags represent text level information. So you can see the text title, you can see the act, the scene, and that sort of information based in these tags at the top. You've also got kind of these levels of, I guess, distinction in the text. So you've got in here, this is saying anything contained within these 2 stage brackets is a stage direction. So we are explicitly saying the computer, ignore this if we don't want stage directions, but what we can do is we can define in here, that's where we find the stage directions. And the same with who's talking. So we can actually define speeches. So everything in here is spoken by Theseus, who has his own label and has other things that are drawn on from this label, which Sam will mention later. We also are retaining LBs, which are line breaks, which again could be very important depending on the research project you're doing. Also, you may have noticed there's a lot of columns. These columns represent the word level information. So based on the taggers that we saw before, these are our original node or the word we were looking at. You've got the part of speech or the word class. You've got their lemma, so their dictionary headword. You've got the semantic class they belong to, and then other things as well. But you've also got the original spelling, as you can see with nuptial and hour. So all of this is retained within the data and you don't actually lose it. So what does that mean for us as corpus linguists? What is really, really beneficial of tagging is it improves our accuracy. So if we're searching for the word will can have 2 possible usages. It can be either used as a noun, so the will to do something, the willpower, or it can be a modal verb, so I will do something. So what we can do here is we can actually specify what sort of will we are looking for. So for example, if I wanted just the modal verbs, 4 days will quickly steep themselves in nights, will here is performing as a verb, this is actually labeled in the data. So in CQP Web, you can choose whether you can see the tags that have been put in, which we see here. So will is labeled as VM because it's used in the modal verb form. And we can actually retrieve just the modal verbs by specifying we want those ending in VM. So hopefully that makes sense. If there are any questions on that, please do ask them in the chat and I will happily explain them in the Q&A. Another thing we can do is we can actually see all the annotation that's available to us in CQP Web. So this is a screenshot from CQP Web. And again, you can see the clear distinction between text level annotation and word level annotation. And all of these are open to inspection in the corpus. Although some are still works in progress, Andrew Hardy is still working on adding things to the corpus. All of this is available and not lost when we convert it from a text into a corpora. So that's me. I know that's a very whistle-stop tour of both corpus and annotation, but hopefully it gives you an example, kind of some examples of how this may be useful to us. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Sam, who will present his own PhD research as a case study of how annotation can be used in a PhD project. So hopefully this will be a smooth transition.
sure it will be. Okay.
Hopefully.
Let me just share my PowerPoint. So, let's get this up. Okay, so as Ellen says, what I'm doing in my half of the presentation is providing some illustration of the role. So I'm going to look at the role of traditional data in my research, as well as how I use these digital methods, corpus linguistics, and specifically corpus annotation to make my life easier. So just a general summary of my research. What I'm interested in is politeness and impoliteness and how this affects language. For example, why do we say, can you pass the salt and not pass the salt? When do we use please and thank you and so on? What's seen little research is the evaluations people make on this basis. So words such as those I've provided here. So words like gentle, gracious, courteous, when do people use these and why? Specifically, I'm looking at Shakespeare's plays because I'm interested in historical development. I also want to look at the historical standards of politeness and impoliteness, and also see how these words might be useful in literature, for instance, in developing characters. However, as you can see here, I'm basically dealing with 109 different words of politeness, 122 different words of impoliteness, and this is around 4,000 instances throughout Shakespeare's plays, which are roughly 1 million words. So more specifically, these are the types of questions I'm looking to answer. There's linguistics. There are linguistic aspects. What type of phrases or sentences are these words used in? What phrases are there? What words do these terms collocate with, i.e. appear near to? And there are also more social aspects. So in which plays does this language appear most often? Which characters use it most? What social status or gender are they, and does it matter? What do you have to do to be evaluated as polite and rude, and so on? So if I were doing this project 50 years ago, literally the first thing I would do is go to the library and get a copy of the Shakespeare text out. The highlighted words here are examples of the words I'm interested in. This is great, really. I mean, I can see the context, I can see what's going on, I can see who's involved and so on. But I'm also interested in looking at, I'm going to look at the word gentle here. So what does it mean to be gentle? Are there any historical dimensions I need to be aware of? So the next thing I would do after going to the Playtex is go to a dictionary. And of course, there aren't any dictionaries better than the OED, especially for historical meanings. So here, what I found is the most likely definition for the use of gentle in the previous slide. It's used in polite addresses, and it also relates to the meaning below, evaluating someone as courteous and polite. It's useful that the OED also uses Shakespeare's plays as an example. So you can see here there are two citations from two Shakespeare plays. It seems likely this is what was meant in the extract from A Midsummer Night's Dream. But as I said, I'm looking at 4,000 instances. So if I were to go to the Playtext and then look in the OED for every single one, my PhD would probably take a decade. It would take a lot longer than I have time for. So what I use is the corpus, and the CQP Web Corpus, which Ella had mentioned, allows me to look at every use. It's free and open access, which is great. And my search here, you can see I've searched the word gentle in the corpus. It's brought up all 369 uses in Shakespeare's plays. And here I've just provided the top few to fit it in a single screenshot. But it goes on for 50 entries on this page and then 8 pages in total. And that's still a lot of instances, and it would still be a lot of work to explore it more. But what you might notice is that many of the instances here are followed by nouns, names like Kate and Harry, as well as other nouns such as suit, exercise, blood, etc. So there's a clear grammatical pattern here, and this is entirely the sort of case where we would want to use part of speech annotation to make our life a little easier. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to quickly stop sharing my PowerPoint and start sharing the corpus itself so I can show you how I would do this. So this is the interface. What I would do is enter the word gentle, which I'm interested in, then the asterisk, which tells the corpus to search any word, but I want to limit these words to nouns. So I then enter the part of speech tag, which tells it to look for any type of noun. When I enter this, what comes up is every single noun phrase using the word gentle. Then it saves, and this is using the part speech annotation that Ellen mentioned. If I go to frequency breakdown, it then gives me a summary of all of these phrases and how frequently they're used. So you can see here, gentle lady is the most common at 12 occurrences, and so on. So that's just a quick demo for you to show how this works. That's right. Okay. So I'm just going to take a sample of these, the ones that are used more than 3 times. And you probably noticed 2 themes here. So the ones I've highlighted in red are all related to female nouns. So lady, queen, madam, and daughter, and mistress. And then the ones I've underlined are all related to status. So lady, master, queen, madam, mistress, sir, duke, and lord. This tells us something about the use of the word gentle, which looking in the plays or in the OED wouldn't reveal. The idea of gentle being used with higher social status characters isn't surprising. It's in the earliest definition in the OED here, and there are many other politeness and impoliteness words which relate to social status. So courtesy, breeding, as well as villain, churlish, and rude, which all relate to the peasantry or the lowest classes at this time. So hypothetically, I would say politeness and impoliteness characters are more relevant to higher status characters. And here the corpus makes my life easier again, because all of the words in the corpus are annotated for the character that speaks them, and all characters are annotated for their social status. I can actually enter all of the words I'm interested in and see which social status uses them most. Here, the corpus has generated a really interesting bar chart, which shows clearly that the higher social status you are, the more likely you are to use these words. So once again, making my life a lot easier. My tentative conclusions here are that gentle has connotations of higher social status and femininity, and the higher social status you are, the more likely you are to use politeness and impoliteness meta-language. Obviously, these are all areas for further research. I'm completely reliant on the traditional methods. I'm reliant on going to the library and getting copies of Shakespeare's plays, and I'm reliant on looking at OED definitions. But corpus linguistics and annotation specifically has very, very quickly revealed hidden dimensions in our data in a matter of seconds. So I'm just going to finish off by saying that I'm going to quickly plug the tool we use, which is CQP Web. It's open access, free, created and managed by Andrew Hardy in the Linguistics department. And also, if anyone else is interested in joining us to talk about how we might use digital approaches on historical data, Ellen and I have this interdisciplinary reading group, and all are really welcome to email us if they want to join. So thank you for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed our talk. If anything's not clear, just let us know, and we'll answer that in the Q&A.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, both. I think we can all agree we've had 4 really great talks there that have certainly sparked a lot of questions from myself, but I'm going to try and not dominate the chat. I have put a few questions in there, and I'm going to just open up the chat to all our attendees. And we'll start taking some questions from all 4 speakers, if that's okay with everyone. So if people have questions, can they just pop them into the chat now if you haven't done so already? We have got a couple ready to go. And if you could just tag them with the person you'd like to ask, or all speakers. I've done an all speakers one there. And I'm going to pass over to my colleague Nicola, who's going to just read out the questions.
Thanks, Joe. So we'll get started straight away. The first question was from me, actually, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it got a few likes. So to Ben, what would happen if you published a paper or data using, for example, tweets, and then users later deleted them? Like, where's the line for when you actually have to retract them?
Yeah, so probably one point of clarity here. You have to remove the data if it comes to your attention that it's been deleted. So you can happily ignore everything and probably get away without doing that. But in theory, if you know it's been deleted, you should do something about it. I'll put them in the chat in a minute. Yeah. I'm just going to link another paper here, which is an interesting discussion on this. In terms of ethics, if you can argue for your research that the deleted tweets are actually the most useful thing you're looking at, then you may well not have to get rid of them. It's Twitter's policy. It's not anything else. And social media platform policies aren't necessarily ethical or good. So if your research is looking at their use, then it's perfectly reasonable to say, well, no, I'm not getting rid of it. It's part of my research. But you have to make sure that ethics clears that.
That's great, thank you. So we'll go a question for you, Ellen, from Vatsala. In your tag for theseus, there's no tag for the. Is there any reason why?
Yeah, it's a good question. The example I gave with the word was taken from the Oxford First Folio, and that was how they chose to shorten Theseus's name in their printed edition. I think it's from 1600. Basically, in your tagging annotation, you can define anything you want however you like. So in the CQP Web example I gave, they just chose to define theseus as theseus, which then has a lookup table attached to it. So it has the social information that Sam mentioned. But basically, long answer short is you can define it however you like, as long as you define it very clearly in a schema. So you say to your users, this is what this is referring to. So that's why if there's any confusion between the and theseus, that's why it's just the choice of the person who's done the tagging, which in this case was the Shakespeare Encyclopedia project. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions from you, Ben, to Ellen. I don't know if you wanted to ask them directly, or I can read off what you popped if you can't remember what you asked.
Yeah, it was around annotating XML, and then if you've got loads of annotated documents, can you take the XML tags a stage further and create kind of link, using the tags, link different people together in the corpus? So say someone's name is spelled differently in various ways, the tag deals with that. But can you then link tags together to say, well, from collocation, these people appear frequently, so can we make a graph of that?
Yep, so I hope I'm not treading on Sam's territory here, but I know, for example, the scene and act levels are also in the XML, so also in those angled brackets. And one thing you could do is potentially tag words across scene and act level. So you can basically take the XML and basically manipulate it. I know some people who in the early modern world work on letters. So in their XML markup, they would potentially have recipient and sender. And I know the work that springs to mind is the work of the Arnott's, and they've basically built social networks based on the recipient and senders of these letters to build up these massive networks based on their annotation. So again, hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, thanks, that's great.
And we've got one here for you, Sam. This is from Jeff Love, who said, my constant question on semantic analysis kind of studies is, do you have some means of identifying ironic uses of something like gentle? Because Shakespeare didn't skimp on the insults. So I guess you touched on this a bit, but if there's more you wanted to add there.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, partly when we're talking about data and sort of digital management, because what I'm basically showing in the presentation is that there are ways of revealing hidden dimensions when you analyze the words as a whole, so when you analyze a big body of the words. But it is always really important to go back down to the play level and look at what's actually happening in these interactions. So for instance, there are ironic uses of these words in a play like The Taming of the Shrew. It's full of them, and we can't separate context from the big data that we're looking at, as it were. So I think in my project, what I do is I try and capture some of these big dimensions and some of the hidden dimensions that come out through annotation, but also I zoom in, as it were, and look at individual plays, individual characters, things like that, and what's actually happening. So yeah, I hope that answers that question. as well.
That's great, thank you. And another one that's come in from Liam Bullingham for you, Sam, is first he says thank you that both parts were fascinating. How do you consider sexism or modern interpretations of gender relations in the text, e.g. gentle or fair, being used by male characters to female characters because they are potentially patronising them? Is it just a social convention of the time?
I think, yeah, I think it kind of, the answer to my last question kind of touches on that a little bit. But building up, one thing I've been doing at the moment is trying to use the corpus to build up a picture of semantics. So, you know, I have these OD definitions, which say there are 26 definitions for this word in Shakespeare's time. And then I've been going through them manually, going through the corpus and actually looking at, okay, it tends to have these definitions. So a word like tender is very, very frequently used to describe women, and in a way that's quite patronizing, in a way that sort of, you know, assumes they're vulnerable and things like that. So I think this, having all of this data at once helps actually clarify what the meaning is in the text, rather than sort of making it quite vague. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah. But thanks to Liam again for his.
That's great, thank you. I'll just squeeze one more question in, and this is to all speakers. Do you think humanities data is well catered for within analysis tools as they're available, given that digital humanities is in its infancy compared to STEM subjects' use of digital tools?
Does anyone want to have a go?
Yeah, I'll have a go quickly because I've got a dash as well. Yeah, I mean, I'd say probably corpus linguistics is ahead of the game here. There's a load of stuff for corpus linguistics, and that's often why you see lots of it in DH research. In other aspects, there are so I've done some network analysis, and that's become more popular. And there is a humanities-based network analysis tool called Gephi. But a few years ago, I was using biomedical science tools to do network analysis for DH work, which was not ideal. So yes and no, it's improving, but it's certainly not the priority for people who make these things. It's ideally data science, and that's seen as social science often, not DH.
Yeah, I agree with Ben. I think a lot of it's about the training available to the researchers as well. I'm very fortunate that I've had experience with coding and training in coding from various stages of my academic career. So I think encouraging people to like invest the time in learning things like coding, which may be taught in STEM type subjects, is something that will open up opportunities to researchers in DH to basically have a go at trying new things of the data and asking new questions of the data too.
Yeah, I think I'd sort of reinforce what Ellen said as well. So that I think we're very lucky, especially at Lancaster, to have the resources we do, and especially in corpus linguistics. You know, it's kind of one of the big homes for it in the world, and I think that is making life a bit easier. But yeah, it's always developing as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Okay, thanks everyone. Okay, so we're over time actually, so I'm going to draw everything to a close there and just wrap up. So there will be a recording available publicly after this event that I will let you know of. Thank you very much everyone today for attending, and I hope you really enjoyed the session. Thank you very much to our 4 amazing speakers and for answering those questions in the discussion at the end. So if you would like to put some applause themed gifts into the chat, now would be the right time for that. I'm going to stop the recording now and do the same. So thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you have a really good day.